In this video, we'll be graphing two trig functions, one sine and one cosine. We'll show you how to do this by hand using a table of values. Then we'll look at the period and the amplitude. We'll determine those characteristics using both the graph and the symbolic form. We'll start with the sine. Here we're asked to graph the function y equals 3 sine of 2x. So what's on my x-axis are the typical input values that I would use for sine. But because I'm going to find 3 times the sine of 2x, we'll start with input values that are half as big. And when we make our table of values, we'll use increments of pi over 2. So in our table of values, x is going to be my input value. Then I need to double that, so 2x, and then take the sine of 2x and 3 times that value. My first input value is 0. 2 times 0 is 0. The sine of 0, according to the unit circle, is 0, and 3 times 0 is 0. The first ordered pair I'm going to plot is 0, 0. Now I'll add pi over 4 as my next input value. 2 times pi over 4 is pi over 2. The sine of pi over 2, thinking of my unit circle, is 1. 3 times 1 is 3. So my next point I'll plot is pi over 4, 3. Now I'll add another increment of pi over 4 to get 2 pi over 4, or pi over 2. We'll double that to get pi. The sine of pi is 0, and 3 times 0 is 0. So my next ordered pair I'll plot is pi over 2, 0. We'll continue like this, adding another increment of pi over 4 to get 3 pi over 4. We'll double that to get 3 pi over 2. The sine of 3 pi over 2 is -1, which when multiplied by 3 is -3. And I'll plot the point 3 pi over 4, -3. Pi, when I double it, is 2 pi. The sine of 2 pi is 0, times 3 is still 0. So the last point I will plot to complete one period of this function is pi, 0. So one period is complete, and I'm going to continue that and extend it. The period of this function, according to the curve, remember the sine starts at 0 and ends at 0. So the period is pi. The amplitude, how high it goes, is 3. Now from my equation, I can figure out the amplitude very easily. It's the number multiplying the trig function. So the amplitude is 3. The period is always going to be 2 pi divided by whatever number is multiplying the x. So 2 pi divided by 2 equals pi. The period is pi. The window that I used to graph this was -2 pi to 2 pi on the x-axis, -3 to 3 on the y-axis. So that was a sine curve. Let's move on to cosine. Once again, our typical input values that we would use on a table of values would go from 0 to 2 pi, and we would use increments of pi over 2. But because I'm doing cosine of x over 2, I want to start with double the typical input values. And x will be my input. I will be using increments of pi instead of pi over 2 because of the fact that I need to divide those inputs by 2. And I will take the sine of the cosine of x over 2, and then 5/2 times that value. So my first input is 0, which when I divide by 2 is still 0. The cosine of 0 is 1. 5/2 times 1 is 5/2. So I'm going to start with my first plotted point of 0, 5/2. As you know, the cosine curve starts high and ends high. I'm going to add an increment of pi for my input. And I divide that by 2 to get pi over 2. Cosine of pi over 2 is 0 times anything is still 0. So my next plotted point is pi, comma, 0. My next input value will be 2 pi, which when I divide by 2 is pi. The cosine of pi is -1. Multiplied by 5/2 is -5/2. The point I'll plot is 2 pi, comma, -5/2. Now we'll move on to 3 pi as my input value. Divide that by 2. Cosine of 3 pi over 2 is 0. 0 times anything is 0. So the point I'll plot is 3 pi, comma, 0. And my last input value here to complete one period of this function is 4 pi. I'll divide that by 2 to get 2 pi. Cosine of 2 pi, according to my unit circle, is 1. And 1 times 5/2 is 5/2. So the point 4 pi, comma, 5/2 is plotted. One complete period is there. Cosine curve starts high and ends high, so we'll continue this. We can tell from our equation that the 5/2 is the amplitude. We can see that in our graph as well. We can tell from our equation that the period will be 2 pi divided by 1/2. To divide by 1/2 is the same thing as multiply by 2. So our period, according to our equation, is going to be 4 pi, and that's verified in our graph. So our period is 4 pi. Our amplitude is 5 over 2. The window that I used on the x was -4 pi to 4 pi, and on the y I went from -5/2 to 5/2.